We are continuing a sermon series called Twisted Truths, Reclaiming the Bible's Most Misunderstood Verses. And we have looked at a couple already. We looked at Matthew 18 in week 1 and talked about the importance of listening with empathy and try to get out of that process of three-step process mindset of Matthew 18 into what really is a deeper level. And then last week we talked about Ephesians 5 in the context of marriage. And then this week we are going to be looking at one of the granddaddies of proof texts, one that I think we've all heard used. If not, we have definitely used it ourselves, most likely. It's found in Matthew chapter 7, verse 1. It's the famous verse, "Do not judge so that you won't be judged." How many of you guys have used that before? Yep, I did too. I have too. It is one that conjures up a lot of imagery and a lot of things in our mind. Many of us have used this passage, and if you're a child of the 90s like I was, you think of songs like Tupac Shakur, right? Only God can judge me. That's right, I got a Tupac reference in church today. I had to figure out a way to get that one in there. But we usually use it to try to get out of some kind of objective truth, right? Like, how dare you define me, or how dare you say what I'm doing is wrong? It's kind of a way for us to try to get out of the accountability of our behavior. And that's how we see it used in a lot in the world, politics, things like this, is, well, how dare you judge me and try to discern what I'm doing as wrong? And what we do there is we proof text it. We make it say something that we want it to say. And we have to be careful of doing that. And we have to ask the question, is that what Jesus is really talking about in that verse? Is he really saying that we shouldn't discern right from wrong, that we shouldn't have some kind of objective truth to our lives? And I think that's absolutely false. I think that Jesus is teaching us something much different there. In fact, what we're looking at in chapter 7 is a Sermon on the Mount, one of Jesus' most famous teachings, if not probably the most famous teaching of all time. But in chapters 5 and 6, he's telling us how to discern right from wrong and what that looks like. And so we shouldn't really take 7 and make it this subjective thing as far as how do we discern. And so what is Jesus talking about? And we're going to look at that this morning, is what is he talking about with Matthew chapter 7, do not judge so that you won't be judged. Well, let me start with a story. So Amy, my wife, she's from San Francisco area, Northern California. And so one time before we had kids, she decided to take me to San Francisco to kind of show me the town. This was years ago, probably about 9 years ago at this point. And she took me to Pier 39 after we went and saw Skywalker Studio. So now you imagine me on Pier 39 with my cotton candy, my lightsaber, just living the dream, okay? And I'm walking down, there's a lot of people on Pier 39, and I remember this car driving by, probably going 30, 40 miles per hour, just blaring on this air horn, how, God hates them and they need to repent or go to hell. And I remember we've all heard the turn and burn kind of message, right? And I remember this family ahead of me, this is probably a teenage girl, 15, 16. I remember her saying, boy, if I was a Christian, I'd be so embarrassed. And I remember at that moment, I was like embarrassed, I was angry. I remember being like, thinking about those people at the air horn, how dare they? I was so judgmental of these people on this air horn. In fact, I kind of put myself in the position as like Jesus' PR person in that moment, right? I was just like, I would never do it that way. Jesus has got to be so mad at those people. And you kind of imagine Jesus standing next to you going, yeah, so right, 100%. You're kind of justified in your own mind, like, yeah, you're so correct, Kelly. Gosh. And, I judge those people up and down during that, people who were driving around with that air horn. And I felt anger, I felt embarrassment, like the girl said. And what I did in that moment, I fell into a trap, I think, that every single one of us go through. This is just a human experience, is this trap. When we attribute behavior and make it someone's identity, right? And right away, I was like, oh, those people are so mean. Those people are so legalistic. Those people are so dogmatic, right? I don't know who those people are. I've never had a conversation with those people. I have no idea their motivations. I just heard one thing they said. Yet I turned into, really, again, Jesus' PR agent, trying to justify and assume and create motivations out of one experience. And what this shows us is something that is extremely human, one that we have all done, and one that has all been done to us. What it is about the human experience is that it shows our proclivity is to be ignorant of our own issues and arrogant towards others. That as humans, we love being able to assume and create motivations and attributions of others without ever really looking ourselves in the mirror and looking at our own stuff. That's not a place we like to look at. We don't want to look at ourselves. We would rather look out into other things. And in fact, what we're going to see is a lot of times what we're projecting out onto others through our judgment actually projects a lot more of what's going on inside of us. I didn't realize at the time, but when I was kind of justifying to myself my own judgment of these people, I think it said a lot more about how I felt about evangelism or how I felt about how that should be done. And so it brought some stuff to the surface. And I think this is really where Jesus is looking to camp in these few verses in Matthew chapter 7. Because if you don't think you're judgmental, just ask yourself this question of what you might think or how you treat people who are judgmental, and you'll learn that you are act back judgmental. Okay? And I think that's kind of what we're looking at here and what Jesus is teaching us. So let's dive into this, because this teaching in Matthew 7 is absolute genius. It absolutely is a key teaching of the ethics of what it means to be human and how it relates to our Lord. So let's first talk with what it means to judge. To judge or not to judge. So the word there is the Greek word krino. Judge is say that with me, krino. Krino, and it has a couple two ways of really understanding it. One of the distinctions is how we exercise judgment. How we exercise judgment. Now this is more of like a distinction or a choice, right? Apple or Android, which one do you judge is better, right? Broncos or Seahawks? Objective truth is the Broncos are far superior versus everybody else. The second understanding, though, is one that I think Jesus is touching on here. So it's not a problem to discern. We should discern right from wrong. That is an absolute truth that we need to do as a people. But there's a second understanding of judge that goes under the wayside, and this is what Jesus is talking about, and that is the understanding of passing judgment. So exercising judgment is a choice, but then there's passing judgment. And this is what we would call in the churchy world condemnation. When we condemn others is a way of passing judgment. Condemnation is when we disapprove of someone's actions with such disdain that we attribute the behavior with their identity. So in our minds, what they have done, they have become that thing. They have become the issue. They embody the disdain we have for that. When my Pier 39 example, when that happened, they were basically, in my mind, they had become everything that was wrong with Christians in that moment. Now, is that fair for me to do? Absolutely not. Right? In my mind, they embodied that. And so, you think about it this way: if someone stole your bike, I got a new bike for my birthday, so this is fresh in my mind. If someone stole my bike, instead of, and if whoever was found was caught, in my mind, if I was condemning them, they say they are just a thief. That is what they are. That is who they are. They are a thief. I have completely dehumanized the person, and now they are the behavior, is what condemnation does. And this happens to all of us, and it's almost unconsciously. Like, it's subconscious. We just do it, right? We don't even try to do it. It just happens. We talk this way. We think this way. A lot of times we don't even realize we're doing it until someone calls us out or until we get caught doing it. In fact, I think it's one of those things that's not only toxic for relationship, but it also is toxic to us individually. And we're going to see why in a minute. But Dallas Willard says this about it. He says, when we condemn another, we really communicate that he or she is in some deep and just possibly irredeemable way bad. Bad as a whole, and to be rejected. So we have completely taken the person out of the picture, and now they are the behavior. So we're condemning the behavior, but in reality, we're condemning the person into rejection. And if we put the shoe on the other foot, it's a terrible thing to be condemned, isn't it? When you are the one that is being rejected. And this is what Jesus says in Matthew 7:2. He says, "For you will be judged by the same standard with which you judge others. and you'll be measured by the same measure you use. Which means, hey, if you're going to go around and condemn others, don't be surprised when it comes back around on you. Don't be surprised when you will actually be self-condemning more than you are grace-filled. This is something that doesn't only go out onto relationships, but it affects us personally. It changes the way we think and the way that we comprehend things. Some of you have been on the other side of this. You've committed a wrong, and it's been hard, if not impossible, to escape the condemnation of it. You have now been officially labeled as that behavior, as that thing. And you have actually captured it, and now it's a part of who you are. You've accepted that reality and that identity. You've been rejected, labeled, made to feel all entirely unworthy, most likely due to others' condemnation or even your own condemnation. This is a key aspect of what it means to be human, because we are very messed up when it comes to how we condemn each other. In fact, some of you might even be multi-generational. It might just be because you have a last name of somebody who did something, and so therefore it's carried over onto you as well. Kind of the principle of the sins of the father affect the son. That you can stand condemned even because of what your family did. This is why Jesus tells us that this type of judgment, this type of condemnation, this type of krinos is to not be associated with his followers. That his community should not be reflective of him in this way. Yes, we need the first aspect of exercising judgment, the ability of discerning right from wrong. But when we drop into the second of when we're sitting in the judgment seats, actually condemning and passing judgment on one another, this is where toxicity happens, where brokenness is reinforced rather than reconciliation. And we one day, and all of us will one day reap the same consequences. If our culture is condemning, as we come to a people and people are condemning one another, it's just a matter of time before we stand condemned ourselves. So what does Jesus teach us to do here? He says in Matthew 7, 3-4, he says, "Why do you look at the splinter in your brother's eye, but don't notice the beam of wood in your own eye? Or how can you say to your brother, 'Let me take the splinter out of your eye,' and look, there's a beam of wood in your own eye?" This is Jesus being funny. This is him using hyperbole as a joke. This is exactly the reaction of the original crowd. They would have been like, what a ridiculous claim, because the image would have been somebody with a giant beam sticking out of their eye trying to be like, let me help you, right? It would have been a ridiculous notion, and it is funny to us now when we think about it, right? But what Jesus is teaching us here is something that even just modern psychology is just putting words to. You'll hear it often called attribution theory. And what Jesus is really teaching here is what we call attribution theory. And attribution theory is a reason that you come up with or to understand why someone does what they do in the way that they did it. What attributed to someone doing that behavior. And so you have what's called internal attribution, which is kind of a characteristic or a disposition. You know, we might say a new driver, 16-year-old, causes a car accident. We may say, well, internal attribution of that was they were a new driver. They just didn't know they didn't have the experience that others drivers would. And then we have the external attribution. This is things like this is kind of like self-deflection, right? So like you're driving a car again and you hit somebody's car in the parking lot and you go, well, they should have been parking in the compact spot, right? It was an external situation. It's not my fault. They just were parked in the wrong spot. You know, some of you have done this, right? And this is called external attribution. Okay, when there's factors outside of a person's control. Now, what happens with condemnation and why this is so dangerous is when we take our internal attributions, the characters, dispositions, like a young kid who's learning how to drive, and what we do is we then make conclusions from it. So because that 16-year-old hit that car, they go, oh, that kid is just a bad driver. He should just never drive again. He just doesn't know how. Now, we wouldn't maybe think of it that way that's kind of an example that we might say, oh, I would never do that. But we definitely do this in other ways. If someone lies, you might say, oh, they're just a big jerk. If someone manipulates, oh, they are just pure evil. Right? We are taking a behavioral thing and we are making it into an identity. In fact, that separates and breaks it, basically schisms relationships completely when we do this. And this is the dangers of condemnation. And we do this so quickly. We do it almost instantaneously. where we make conclusions and attributions so fast about people, but we fail to ever really take the time to understand them. This is how misunderstandings occur, this is how poor communication occurs, this is how assumptions are made, and this is how more relationships are broken. Jesus' teaching here is to to give us a healthy look in the mirror before we make any conclusions about people outside of us. He says your vision is impaired. And in fact, if you had a beam sticking out of your eye, I would say your vision's pretty well impaired. You're not going to be able to see things very clearly, right? And so what happens is right, we have an impairment of vision. And the amazing thing is, in this, Jesus is definitely calling out that there's a speck. He's not discounting this behavior. He's not saying, let's excuse this behavior and pretend it's not there. No, he is going to have us speak into it, which is good. We should speak into each other's lives. That's a good part of what it means to be in community. But he says the first thing he wants you to do, and he emphasizes this with the beam, is he wants to first do a work in you before you ever try to fix somebody else. And this is the part that often gets glossed over. Again, we run to things like Matthew 18 that we talked about last week, and you're like, well, let me just call everything out in people's lives when I see it. How fun is that, right? When you have someone who just goes and exposes. What we do is we bypass Matthew 7, go to Matthew 18, and make everything about calling each other out. When Matthew 7 in Sermon on the Mount says, first, let me do the work in you. First, take the assessment, take your condemnation to me first. Let me do a work in you before you ever speak into somebody else's life. This is a really amazing teaching, that he wants to work in you before you try to help others. We have to own our own beams of condemnation. We have to be able to reflect those. We have to be able to see those for what they are. Because what we do is we create patterns of thinking, patterns of condemnation. Guess what? If you're condemning a lot of people outside, I'm betting that you're condemning yourself for a lot of things. We have to be wary of this. If we don't learn to assess our own beams, we train our minds to assume that everything that has gone wrong in our life is our own fault. In fact, this isn't about taking accountability. This is really just more about passing judgment on your own self, right? And this is a real issue when you have a God and you're praising that says, I'm forgiven, I believe in grace and all these things, but yet on your own self, you're like, I am garbage, I am junk, you're just passing judgment, condemning yourself, and guess what? That's going to leak out and you're going to be a very judgmental person. You have to first be able to accept and receive and believe in the grace of a new creation before you can give it out. We are also projecting our own impairments. This is exactly what I was doing at Pier 39. I was projecting my own impairments. If you feel like everyone is lying to you or manipulating to you, you need to stop and pause and think, am I projecting that because I feel like I lie and manipulate, or because I have done that? And what we're doing is we often will project out exactly who we think we are to others, misapplying motivations, making assumptions. As believers and as Christians, we do this all the time. I think we probably do it with each other the worst than anybody in the world. I mean, how often as Christians do we make kind of these superiority claims when it comes to theology even, right? We call these straw man fallacies, right? When you're in conversations with each other, or because they don't align to maybe your idea or your thinking or your church process or your church organization, they're somehow inferior to you. Or maybe they're not as smart as you, or maybe their motivations are wrong. I remember having conversations with people in my past, I'm like, well, you don't take Scripture seriously. I'm like, well, I'm sure I do, just because I don't align to exactly what you said, right? And this is how, you just go online. This is social media, Facebook, Instagram, Christian world, right? We are just vile with one another, making assumptions and misunderstanding one another. And a lot of this is projection. It can be at least projection out into how we feel, our own insecurities about things. And we do this almost subconsciously. And so this is why Jesus is talking to his people, saying this has no place to be in the community of people who follow me. These beams are barriers of impairment, stopping us from seeing others and ourselves the way Jesus sees people and us. This is what he's trying to get to, is I want you to remove that beam so that you can see the person in front of you as I see them, and you can see yourself as I see you. This is the dangers of condemnation and the dangers of passing judgment. We have to remove those beams. We condemn and crush others while at the same time being crushed by our own condemnation for ourselves and others. And Jesus has some stark words for him. He says in verse 5, "Hypocrite, first take the beam of wood out of your eye, and then you will see clearly to take the splinter out of your brother's eye." So he doesn't say just excuse the behavior, excuse the sin, whatever it is. You're not just, that's how the twisted idea of judge, or the judgment twist is really this idea of, well, we just dismiss it. Well, no, we don't dismiss it. We pause and we evaluate ourselves. We look in the mirror, we sit with Jesus before we go and try to take that splinter out. Because condemnation is a vicious cycle. We start with condemning others. We are then guilty of the same thing, which is, imagine coming into this room and you have like your deepest, darkest secret of condemnation. All of a sudden, everybody's just aware of it. That would not be very fun, would it? That would be difficult. Before we condemn others, we must also understand that we could very well stand condemned of the same thing, if not even worse things, or whatever. So the answer is that we deal with our being. We deal with our own condemnation. Jesus tells us to deal with it, deal with our brokenness and condemnation before we ever try to do so in someone else. This is why before we do the Matthew 18 stuff, before we decide, hey, I'm going to go expose these things, we have to do the work of Matthew 7. Go to your brokenness and condemnation to Jesus first. Sit with it. Pause. When the assumptions and things are rolling in, you got to have the self-awareness to say, stop, pause. Is this really a reality? Is this really the truth? Do I have enough information to be able to do this? And then we go and we sit with Jesus. Because the solution to this is that we sit in the presence of Jesus with our own condemnation. We take it. We take our own judgmentalism. We take our own assumptions, our motivations, and we lay them on the table with Jesus and go, what do you want me to do with this? Help me to work this out. Help me to bubble things to the surface of which I am internally condemning myself with. It wasn't until you start doing that you start to see your motivations, your assumptions, your brokenness start to come to the surface that it can be dealt with. So when you feel the need to pass judgments, when you feel the need to make assumptions or condemn the actions of others, this is where you need to pause. Recognize the beam in your eye. Sit with it. Sit with Jesus. Bring him into it. When we do this, we begin our focus begins to shift from how dare they and how much better you are, and I would never do such a thing like that. Your shifting starts to go, and you start to look at Jesus, and you start to see yourself through his reflection as you go, boy, the things I've done, the things I've contributed, the things I've broken, the things I've brought condemnation in, I have received grace and forgiveness and mercy and compassion and love, and you start to recognize some things that Jesus did for us rather than the judgment and condemnation. The byproduct of this time with him is we lower ourselves into a standard of humility. We don't see us as an opposition to one another, right? Which is what condemnation does. We're kind of in a superior place and we're condemning down onto somebody. Instead, we're both standing side by side in our own condemnation, looking to Jesus, looking at him. How do you handle this? How do you do this? We are the same. We are humans. We need a Savior. We are brought into a place of mutuality. This way we can still discern right and wrong without allowing condemnation to completely reject or define a person. And this is the goal, that we approach one another once we have done the work of bringing our own condemnation to Jesus, understanding that we have our own brokenness, our own internal projections, our own attributes that have been given to us, understanding that, boy, I would hate if that was me in your shoes, being able to be empathetic, which is a key word here at this church, is how do we be empathetic towards one another? How do we understand the place and person of the person that we are speaking to rather than coming at them with judgmentalism? And this is exactly what Jesus does. And multiple times he does this. One of them is in John 8 with the woman caught in adultery. When the Pharisees are getting ready to stone her. Right? He gets it and he writes something in the sand. No one knows what he writes. That's like the greatest mystery that I can think of is what does he write? But what he says is more profound. In John 8:10-11, he says, when Jesus stood up, he said to her, "Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you?" "No one, Lord," she answered. "Neither do I condemn you," says Jesus. "Go, and from now on, do not sin anymore." So here we have a woman who was caught into adultery, and forever she could have been condemned and identified as that person in the community. I mean, she was sentenced to a life of condemnation just being a part of that. Yet Jesus, the only one who has any right and the ability to judge anybody, to condemn anybody, he chooses not to do it. Instead, he chooses to elevate her. He says, go. He calls her to something greater. He says, go and sin no more. Live a life outside of brokenness and rebellion and death. Live a life that is one that gives life and brings life, and it redefines who she is. I'd like to think it completely redefines her. Another one is John 4 with the woman at the well. Right? Here he is, a woman who's been ostracized from society, a part of Samaria, which is a historical enemy of Israel. Just decades before, they had a great fight and battle, and they were in opposition to one another. And on a hot day, she goes in the middle of the afternoon, which again says that she was ostracized by her community, and she meets Jesus there. And they have this great discussion about theology and who he is, and she's one of the first people that Jesus will actually express who he is to. The disciples themselves are still wondering who this is. In fact, in that story, they go, "Who is this guy?" Right? And so he could have easily said, "Hey, you had 5 husbands. The guy you're living with now is not your husband." He could have easily brought condemning behavior. He could have said, "Hey, you're just an adulteress too," just like he does just like the lady in John 8. But he doesn't. He doesn't. He says, "Go. Go." And so no more. And she becomes one of the first person to actually preach who Jesus is to her community. This is an elevation, a redefinement of who she was. She didn't go back to that village, the woman with 5 husbands. She went back to that village as the woman who had an encounter with Jesus. And that's how we remember her now. And this is exactly what Jesus does with our condemnation. When we make mistakes, when we sin, when we do things, it's so easy for humanity to say, this is who you are now. You are a rebel, you are this, you are identified by that behavior. But Jesus says, no, I don't condemn you. I redefine you. Bring me the condemnation, he says, and I will change the way you think. I will change the way you think about yourself. I will change the way you approach people. You bring me with my condemnation, you'll receive compassion and love and grace and mercy. And exactly that's what we should be projecting out from us, because that's what we've received. That when we see behavior that is brokenness and sin in our community, we first do the work of coming together with Jesus, getting that clarification, understanding that, and then going to the person so that we do not condemn. This is something that every human can relate to. This is a teaching that every human can grasp, can understand. We've all been there. We've all experienced it. And it's the teaching of those who follow Jesus to be one that reflects him and how he does things. And so we cannot be a people who bring condemnation, but bring about the restorative power of what Jesus offers, which is grace and forgiveness, love and mercy. We're going to take some time to reflect on this before we jump into our children dedications. So let's take just a couple minutes here between you and the Lord. If you have a kid who's going to get dedicated, you're now free to go to get them, but we're going to do communion right after this. But let's take a few minutes just between you and the Lord. Place your condemnation on the table with him. Bring him into it. Maybe it's self-condemnation, or maybe it's condemnation against others. But let's take a few minutes ourselves just with him to reflect on that.